But Fenrir had never been a monster. He had come in as a cub. He was kept in Asgard openly in the light, where anybody who wanted to could walk out and look at him. There was straw put down for him at the end of the yard, and it was changed when it needed changing. There was water carried out to him in the morning. For a while there was even a kind of pride in the thing. No other hall in the 9 worlds had a wolf lying in its grass. He was fed by hand. That was the part the tellings kept, and it was the part that mattered. Somebody walked out to him every day with meat on a board. He stood near enough to be bitten. He was not bitten, not then, and not for a long time afterwards. The wolf took what he was given and lay down again in the sun. The grass under him was flattened into the shape of him, and it stayed that way all summer. The gods watched him grow at first. They watched him the way anyone watched a young animal. They watched him fondly and without much attention on the way to other business. Then they began to measure him against the doorway. Then they began to measure him against themselves. Nothing had happened, and he had killed nobody. He had broken nothing that anybody wanted. A thing had been said about him before he was old enough to hear it said. The saying of it had got into them the way cold water got into stone. It worked slowly, and then all at once, when the frost came. That was where the monster came from, not out of the Ironwood in the east where he was whelped. Not out of his mother, who was a giantess, not out of his father, who was Loki. The monster came out of the arithmetic that was being done about him in the halls at night. It was done quietly, in low voices, over ale that was going cold. It was done by the same people who walked out and fed him in the morning. He was the first of them. He was not the last. There were others in the water and under the ground, and others out past the edge of anything a man had ever drawn. The North had a name for every one of them, and it used the names carefully. There would be a serpent put into the sea as a child, who grew until there was no more ocean left to grow into, and who took his own tail in his mouth to finish the ring. There would be a man who lay down on gold for long enough to stop being a man. He would not be able to choose his way back out of the shape he had chosen. There would be wolves running the sky behind the sun and the moon. There would be dead men who came back down the road to their own doors and stood outside them in the dark. There would be a hound chained at the mouth of a cave with its breast wet. And there would be a thing out in the deep water so large that ships tied up to it in fair weather and lit their cooking fires on its back and called it an island. Some of them were made by gods, some were made by men out of themselves on purpose and knew what they were doing while they did it. One of them was made by nobody at all. He had been standing at the southern edge of everything with a sword in his hand since before there was an edge for anyone to stand at. He was in no hurry. He would be the one still standing at the end of it. But it began with the wolf, it began with the people who kept on feeding him. Part 1. The feeding, the Ironwood stood east of everything, and it had a bad name even among giants. It was a forest of black iron trees. They grew close together, and they did not move in wind. An old giantess lived in it, whose name nobody troubled to keep. She bred wolves there, and she bred them in the shape of men. The litters came one after another for longer than anyone had been counting. In that wood, in that country, Angrboda bore 3 children to Loki. She bore them without help, and she raised them without hiding them, and that was the last ordinary thing that happened to any of them. The eldest was a daughter. One side of her was a living girl, and the other side was the colour of a body 3 days under the ground. The second was a son, and he came out long, and he went on being long. The third was a wolf, and they called him Fenrir. Word of them travelled the way, word of a birth always travelled, slowly, and then everywhere. It reached the halls of the gods in the mouths of people who had heard it from somebody else. With it came a saying about what the three of them would do when they were grown. The saying was very old, and nobody could name the first mouth it had come out of. Odin heard it in the high seat where he heard most things. He sat with it a while, then he sent riders east. They came back with all 3 children in the autumn, and the gods dealt with them one at a time. The daughter Odin carried down himself past the roots of the world. He gave her a cold country that nobody else wanted, and he left her standing in it. The serpent he took out to the deep water and dropped over the side, and that one took a very long time to finish. The wolf they kept him because he was small. That was the whole of the reasoning, and it was said aloud, and everybody agreed with it. He was a cub, and he could be carried under one arm. Whatever he was going to be, he was not it yet, a thing that had not yet become what it would be looked to almost anybody like a thing that could still be talked out of it. So the wolf came to Asgard, and Asgard made room. They gave him the far end of the yard, past the smithy where the ground sloped away toward the wall. Straw was laid down for him there in a great heap. It was raked over and replaced when it went sour. A trough was set in the grass and filled every morning. It was a proper trough, cut from stone, because a wooden one had not lasted the first month. There was no fence. Nobody had suggested a fence. A fence would have said something aloud that nobody was yet ready to say. In the beginning, the young gods went down to look at him after supper. They stood in a loose half-circle at a polite distance, and they made the noises people made at animals. He looked back at them with his chin on his paws, and did not get up. Some of them threw him things. He caught what was worth catching and let the rest lie. He slept a great deal, as young animals did, and he slept on his side with his legs straight out. The smell of him was the smell of any large dog, warm and faintly of iron, and not unpleasant in the open air. When it rained, he did not go under anything. He lay where he was and let the water run off him. In the morning the sun found him, and the steam came up off his back. The smiths got used to him first, because they worked nearest. They stopped looking up when he shifted. In the middle of the afternoon the fires were hottest, and the doors were propped open. He would come and lie in the shade thrown by the smithy wall. The men inside went on hammering with a wolf asleep 4 feet from their threshold. One of them took to setting a bucket of water out on his own account. Nobody had asked him to, and he never mentioned it. That was the first year, and it was a good year, and nobody in it was pretending. They were fond of him. The tellings never quite held on to that afterwards, once everything else had happened. For 1 whole year the gods of Asgard were simply fond of a wolf. They fed him, and they stepped over him in the yard. They did not think about it very much at all. Tyre fed him. It began as a chore, and it stayed one, and that was the only reason it lasted as long as it did. Somebody had to carry the meat down. Tyre carried it. He came out of the hall in the early part of the day with a board on his shoulder, and he walked the length of the yard. He set the board down within reach, and he stood there while it was eaten. He stood close. That was the part everybody noticed, and nobody discussed. The others put the board down at arm's length and stepped back. Some slid it forward with a foot, and some sent somebody younger. But Tyr stood where his own hand was, inside the reach of the jaws, and he stayed there until the board was clean, and then he picked it up and carried it back. He did it every morning, and he did it in weather that would have excused him. He did not appear to think about it. When it was mentioned to him, he answered as though the question had been about the meat. The wolf came to know the hour. He would be up and waiting before there was anything yet to see. He faced the hall door with his ears forward, and he followed Tyr with his eyes the whole way down the yard. When Tyr crouched to set the board in the grass, the wolf put his nose against the man's shoulder once briefly. Then he ate. Nobody ever set down what Tyr did with his hand in that moment. The likeliest answer was that he did nothing at all. He grew that winter, then he grew again. Nobody measured him, so he was not measured in numbers. He was measured in the ordinary things that stopped fitting. The collar they had put on him for the look of it in the spring was cut off him before the frost. The trough had to be moved out from the wall so that he could set himself square to it. By midsummer of the second year he lowered his head coming through the yard gate. By the autumn he did not use the gate. His print in the wet ground beside the trough was wider than a man's two hands laid side by side. The young ones came down to put their hands in it, and after a while they stopped doing that. The straw at the end of the yard had worn into a hollow in the earth, and the grass would not come back in it. Where he lay against the smithy wall in the afternoons, the stone had been polished dark and smooth to the height of a tall man's chest. It stayed that way for a long time after there was no wolf in Asgard at all. But somewhere in the second year the fondness turned over into something else, and nobody decided it. The change was in the looking. They had looked at him because he was pleasant to look at. Now they looked at him the way a farmer looked at a river in a wet spring, often and briefly and never straight on. The half-circle after supper stopped forming. The young ones found other places to be. Errands began to be routed the long way around the far side of the smithy, and the long way became the ordinary way. Within a season nobody could remember having chosen it. The wolf noticed. He noticed it a long while before anything was said aloud. An animal always knew when it was being watched differently, and he had no idea what he had done because he had done nothing. He went on lying in the shade of the wall. He went on getting up when the hall door opened in the morning. He went on putting his nose against the shoulder of the one man who still walked the whole way down the yard. That man went on coming every day for as long as it lasted. But in the halls at night they had begun to talk about him with the doors shut. They talked about how much he would eat by the third year. They talked about what he would be able to reach. They talked about whether the old saying had meant this wolf or some other wolf entirely. They talked in the low, careful voices of people who had already decided and were looking for company in it. And on the far side of the yard he lay out in the grass in the last of the light, with his legs straight out, waiting for the morning. Somewhere behind him, out of sight, in a shed with the doors closed, iron was being worked for the first time in a very long while. Part 2. Leyding and Dromi, the iron came out of the shed in the spring of the third year, and it took 8 of them to carry it. They had made a chain, and they had given it a name, which was Leyding. The name was old, and the meaning had worn smooth on it, but it was the kind of name given to a thing that held. They laid it out in the grass in a long curve, and it lay there the way a river lay in a valley. The links were as thick through as a man's wrist. They had come out of the fire that morning, and they were still cold at the heart. The damp of the night stood on them in beads. The whole length of it steamed a little in the early sun. The wolf came down to look at it, because everybody had come down to look at it. They had thought carefully about how to say the thing, and they said it well. They told him that this was a famous chain. They told him there had been an argument in the hall about whether anything alive could break it. The argument had gone on for some while. His name had come up in it more than once. They said it lightly, the way an unrehearsed thing was said, and they had rehearsed it a great deal. The wolf looked at the chain for a long time. He was not a stupid animal, and he had never been one. He went along the links with his eyes, and he did his own arithmetic, and he came out of it satisfied. He had grown a great deal in 2 years. He knew exactly what he could do in the way that any strong creature knew it, without vanity and without much interest. The chain was heavy, and it was well made, and it was not enough. But the reason he lay down and let them put it on him had nothing to do with the chain. For 1.5 years the gods had been looking at him the other way, the wet spring river way, briefly and never straight on. And here they all were, standing round him in the grass in the morning. They were looking at him the way they had looked at him when he was small. They were interested, they were pleased with him. Somebody laughed at something, somebody else said, and it was a real laugh. He had not heard one of those in the yard for a long while. He would have lain down for a great deal less than that. So they bound him with Leyding, they wound it round him and drew it close. Then they stepped back a good distance, which he noticed and did not mind. He broke it with one movement. He did not even get properly up. He set his shoulders, he put his weight out through his forelegs once, the way a dog stretched. The chain came apart in 3 places at once, with a sound like a bell being dropped. The pieces went out into the grass. One of them slid all the way to the wall. The praise came, and it was loud, and it went on slightly too long. They said his name. They said they had never seen the like of it. They came a step or 2 closer than they had stood before. One of the younger ones put a hand flat on his shoulder for a moment. The wolf stood in the middle of it with his tail going and his ears up. That was the best hour he ever had in Asgard. It had been arranged. Every single person in that circle knew it except him. They spent the whole of the following winter on the second one. It was made in the same shed with the doors closed, and it took longer. The sound of it carried over the yard on the still nights. When they brought it out in the spring, it was twice the weight of the first. The links were doubled, and each one was drawn out long. It had been worked and worked again, until the iron had gone a dark colour all through. They called it Dromi 8 had carried Leyding. It took a good many more than 8 to carry Dromi. They did not make it look easy, because they had decided not to. They were less cheerful this time. And the wolf noticed that as well. He walked out and looked at this one the way he had looked at the other, and he was slower about it. He could see what it was. He could see the doubled links, and the long draw of them, and the darkness of the iron. He understood, without anybody telling him, that this chain had been made for him. It had been made for him and for nothing else in the world. There was a while when nobody said anything at all, and the wind came across the yard, and the iron did not move in it. Then he reasoned the thing out, and the reasoning was his own, and it was not foolish. He had grown since the spring before, and he knew by how much. Nothing had ever been won by anybody who would not go near a risk. Reputation was not given out for breaking easy things. And if he never let them put a chain on him again, the last 2 years would settle into their final shape. Everyone would go on walking round the far side of the smithy forever. The looking would never come back. He lay down in the grass a second time. Dromi took him longer, and it hurt. He kicked out, and the chain held. He rolled his weight over onto his shoulder and drove down with his hind legs, and the chain held again. The doubled links dragged in along his ribs and shut on him. For a moment, out in the middle of that field, in front of everybody, the wolf understood what it would be to be held. He got his feet under him. He put everything he had into it at once, and the iron went. It went further than the first time. The links flew out over the grass in every direction. One of them struck the smithy wall high up and left a mark that was still there long afterwards. The men inside came out to see what had happened. 2 sayings came out of that morning, and the North kept both of them for centuries after it had stopped keeping anything else. When a man got clear of a difficulty by a hard shove, he was said to have got loose out of Leyding. When he got clear of one that had very nearly finished him, he was said to have laboured out of Dromi. People went on saying it in places where nobody could any longer have told what a Dromi was. The wolf lay in the grass and got his breath back, and the praise came again, and it was thinner. But the gods had learned what they came to learn, and it was not what they had told themselves they wanted to learn. They had wanted the chain to hold. Now they knew it with the certainty of people who had tried it twice in front of witnesses. There was no chain anywhere that would hold this animal. They were not going to make one. The whole line of attack had been wrong from the start. And the wolf had learned something too, though he did not put it into words because he had no words for it. He had learned that they would keep bringing chains. Nobody picked up the broken links. They lay out in the long grass where they had fallen, both sets of them going brown. They were still lying there years later, when the grass had grown up over them, and nobody walked in that part of the yard at all. That night the hall doors stayed shut for a long time, but some while before it was light, a rider went out of Asgard by the low gate. He took the road that went downward the whole way into country where the iron was not made in sheds. Part 3. Gleipnir. The road to Svartalfheim went down for 3 days and never once went up. Skirnir rode it alone, because that was what he was for. He was the errand rider of the gods, and he had been sent to places worse than this one. The light thinned as he went. It did not go dark so much as go grey, and then a deeper grey. The country on either side of the road had shape, but no colour in it at all. There was no wind down there. The sound of the horse came back off the rock a moment after it was made. The workshop of the dwarves stood at the bottom, and it was warm. That was the thing nobody ever expected. It was warm, and it smelled of hot metal and scorched horn and old fat. A man who could stand the ceiling would have called it the most comfortable place in the 9 worlds. The forges ran along one wall in a row, 9 of them, and none of them was ever let go out. Above the fires, the roof was black and shining, and it had been black and shining for longer than Asgard had stood. Water came down the far wall in a thin sheet and went away under the floor. It made a sound like somebody breathing in the next room. Things were stacked everywhere in a way that looked like disorder and was not. There were ingots in bins, sorted by a system that no one from outside had ever been told. There were hides folded on shelves. There were coils of drawn wire hanging on pegs from thickest to thinnest. The last few were finer than anything a man could see. They were hung there all the same. Nothing in that room had been made to be looked at. Every object in it was the answer to a question somebody had asked. Skirnir put the question to them, and they listened to the whole of it without interrupting. He told them what the gods wanted, and why the 2 chains had failed, and what the animal had done to them in front of everybody. The dwarves did not say anything for a while. Then they told him that the gods had been making the wrong mistake twice, which was worse than making 2 different ones. Iron answered strength with strength, and the wolf had more of it. What was wanted was a thing that had nothing to push against. Then they went and got what they needed, and the North remembered the list for 1,000 years. They took the sound of a cat's footfall, they took the beard of a woman, they took the roots of a mountain and the sinews of a bear. They took the breath of a fish, and last of all they took the spittle of a bird. 6 things, and all 6 of them impossible, and that was the point of them. And that was why there was no longer any of these things left anywhere in the world. A cat would walk across a floor and make no sound at all, because the sound had been used. No woman would grow a beard. Nobody digging on a mountain would ever come to the bottom of it. A fish opened and closed its mouth in the water and drew no breath. A bird had a dry mouth. Any child could have told the same list to anybody who asked. The dwarves had not stolen those things. They had simply been the ones to spend them. But what came out of it was not a chain, and the gods were disappointed when the bag was open. Gleipnir was a ribbon. It was smooth and it was soft, and it ran through the fingers like a length of good wool. It weighed almost nothing. It could be wound 3 times round a man's forearm, and the man would forget he had it on him. Somebody said aloud on the boat that they had gone all the way down to Svartalfheim and come back with a girl's hair tie. Nobody laughed, and the one who said it did not say anything else. The lake was called Fafnir, and the island in the middle of it was called Lyngvi. They took him out to it by boat, which took most of a morning, and they were careful about the reason they gave. They said there was sport to be had on the island. The wolf came without being pressed. He had never been on a boat before, and he did not care for it. He stood in the middle of the hull with his legs apart and his weight low the entire way across. The water was black and completely flat. The island was small. It had heather on it and nothing else standing. The gods spread out on the shore in a wide, loose ring as soon as they were off the boat. Then they showed him the ribbon. They passed it round first, which had also been arranged. Each of them took hold of it and pulled at it and could not part it. Each of them made a great deal of that and handed it on. When it came back round, they held it out to the wolf. They told him a creature who had broken Dromi would have no trouble with a piece of silk. But the wolf looked at it for a while. Then he looked at the ring of them standing on the heather. He said that he could see no fame in breaking a thread that thin. He said that if it was made with cunning rather than with strength, then thin or not, it was not going to come off his legs. And then he said the sentence that everybody in that ring had been dreading since before they got into the boat. There was no honest answer to it. He said that if they were dealing straight with him, they would not mind giving him a pledge. Fenrir wanted a hand in his mouth while the ribbon went on. But nobody moved. The lake did not move either. It was a bright, cold morning, and the whole of it had gone very quiet. The gods stood in their ring on that small island. They looked at one another, and not at him. It went on long enough to become the answer. The wolf watched them do it and understood exactly what he was being told, and he had known it in some way since the boat. Then Tyr came out of the ring and put his right hand in the wolf's mouth. He did it without a speech. He did not look round first, and he did not look for anybody's face. No telling ever gave him a line to say at that moment. Not in any language the story was carried into, and not once anywhere. He walked forward, he put his hand in as far as the wrist. He stood there in the same place he had stood every morning for 3 years, and he waited while they wound the ribbon on, but it went on light. That was the horror of it. It lay against him like a thread of wool, and he could hardly feel where it was. He kicked out, and Gleipnir took hold. He threw his weight sideways, and it took hold harder. The more he fought it, the smaller it grew. It was cutting in now, where it had been lying loose. He put everything into it, as he had done with Dromi, and this time nothing went. The ribbon did not stretch, and it did not sing under the strain. It simply held and went on holding, and the harder he worked, the more thoroughly it held him. And the whole ring of them laughed. They laughed out loud on the shore of that island, in relief. People laughed that way when a thing they had feared for 2 years turned out to be finished. Every one of them laughed except two. Tyr did not laugh, because his arm was in the wolf's mouth. And the wolf did not laugh because he had just worked out what the laughing meant. He closed his jaws. The laughing stopped, as though a door had been shut on it. Tyr stepped back out of the reach of the head and looked at the end of his own arm. He did not make a sound about it, then or afterwards. He was the only one who had been dealing straight, and he was the only one who paid. He would be called the bravest of them for the rest of the world's existence. He had earned it in one morning, and he had known the price of it before he started. Then they finished what they had come to do, and they did it thoroughly. They took the loose end of the ribbon and made it fast to a cord called gelgja. They drew the cord down through a hole in a rock called jewel and set the rock into the ground. Then they took a boulder called thviti and drove it down on top as a peg. It went so far down that the top of it lay level with the heather. The wolf came up off his side and gaped at them, and the gape was wide enough that they stopped work and stood back. So they put a sword into his mouth. The hilt went into the flesh of the lower jaw. The point went up into the roof of it. It held his head open, and it stayed there. He howled then, and he went on howling, and the sound came off the flat water and travelled a long way. After a while the slaver began to run out of the corners of his open mouth. It ran down through the heather to the lake, and it never stopped running. It made a river. The river had a name of its own before very long. The name they gave it was Van, which in the old speech meant expectation and also meant hope. Nobody ever lived on that island. The gods rowed back across the flat water in the early afternoon and tied up the boat. No one would go out there again for pleasure, and the river ran on across the heather in the grey light, out of the mouth of a bound animal, in a country where there was nothing else at all to hear. Part 4. The Ring in the Sea. Of the 3 children out of the Ironwood, only one of them ever had to be bound. The gods had thought about the second one for a long while before they did anything. He was a difficulty of a different kind. He did not break things, and he did not frighten anybody yet, and there was nothing about him that a chain would have answered. So in the end they did the simplest thing that had ever occurred to any of them. They gave him to something that had no edges. He went over the side of a boat in deep water, and he was small enough to carry in 2 hands. That was all of it. There was no ceremony, and there were no witnesses worth the name. Odin took him out past the last of the skerries on a grey day and dropped him in. The water took him, the boat came back. Nobody said afterwards that it had been cruel. Nobody said it had been anything. It was the neatest piece of work the gods ever did, and it was the one that finished them. There was not a soul on that boat who felt uneasy on the way home. Then he grew, because the sea was not a place that stopped anything from growing. It took him a long time, and nobody was watching. He fed on what was down there, and he kept going down. For a great many years he was simply a large animal in a large ocean. The world had always had room for those, but there came a season when he had eaten most of what would fit in his mouth. After that he began to go upward instead of down. He went along the floor of the world in a long, slow curve, and there was nothing anywhere to turn him back. He grew until he ran out of ocean. That was the moment worth stopping on, and no telling ever quite managed to describe it. He came round the whole of the middle world under the water, and he arrived at last back at the place he had started from. There was nothing further to go along, so he opened his mouth and he took hold of his own tail, and he shut it and he lay still. And that was the shape he kept, and the shape gave him the name that everybody used afterwards. He was Jormungandr, the serpent of the middle enclosure. He was the Midgard serpent, and the ring round the world. Men who went to sea knew about him the way men in any trade knew about the thing that could kill them. They did not talk about it much, but they did not say Jormungandr out loud on the water. A name spoken over deep water would travel a good deal further than a name spoken on land. They called him the Long One, they called him the Belt, and the Girdle, and the one lying down. An old man on a beach in Hålogaland would say all three in the course of a morning. He would never once say the word itself. He would have been unable to explain why, and he would not have been embarrassed about it either. They read him in the water instead. There was a swell that came from nowhere on a still day with no weather anywhere in the sky. It did not break, and it did not travel in the usual way. It lifted a boat and set it down and went on, and it came from the direction of no coast at all. The old men said that was him turning over in his sleep, a very long way out. There was also a thing the water did at the edge of the world in clear weather. The horizon would stand up slightly instead of lying flat. They had a name for that too, and it was the same name. He slept for most of the world's existence. He was not lying out there planning anything. He had no grievance that he could have put into words. He did not know that he had been dropped over the side rather than lost. He was an animal that had been made too big for the place it was in. The people who did it had wanted a solution that would not require them to look at him again. He lay round the world in the cold with his tail in his teeth, and the water went over him and the years went over him. Twice in all that time somebody woke him up. Both times it was the same red-bearded god, and neither time was an accident. Part 5. The ox head. The first time Thor had his hands on him and was not told what he was holding. It happened in a giant's hall in the east, at the end of a long evening of games that had all been arranged to be lost. They brought out a grey cat and told him to lift it off the floor. He got one paw up. He was ashamed of it for years. He was still ashamed of it when somebody finally explained, afterwards and from a safe distance, what the cat had been. It had been the middle world's serpent. Lifting one paw of it had been the most frightening thing anybody in that hall would ever watch. The second time he went looking on purpose, and he took a boat. He came to Hymir's farm out on the edge of the northern water, in the shape of a young man with no name worth asking about. Hymir was a giant of the old cold kind, and he kept a herd. He went out fishing every day of his life, in a boat that was too heavy for two men. He agreed to take the young stranger out in the way a man agreed to something he expected to regret. Then he told him to see to his own bait, since a guest who wanted feeding could catch it himself. So Thor walked out to the herd, and he looked along it, and he chose the biggest animal in it. The ox was called Himinhörjod, which meant the one that bellows at the sky, and it was the finest beast Hymir owned. Thor took its head off with his hands and carried the head down to the shore. He did not hurry, and he did not explain, and he set it in the bottom of the boat where the bait went. Hymir looked at the head of his best ox lying in the bilge with the eyes still bright. Then he got in and pushed off, because there was nothing else left to do with the morning. They rowed, and the rowing was the part the old poem lingered on. Hymir pulled well, and he was proud of it, and he found within a few hundred strokes that he was being carried. The young man had the forward oars and was rowing as though the boat were empty. They came out to the grounds where Hymir took his whales. Hymir shipped his oars and said that this was far enough. He said the water past here was bad. The young man went on rowing. He rowed until the land was a low grey line, and then until it was nothing at all. Hymir sat in the stern of his own boat with his hands on his knees and did not ask again. Then Thor put the ox head on a line and dropped it over the side, down where the serpent lay. A thing came through the cold water with the smell of blood on it. He had not eaten in a long time. He had no reason on earth to suspect a piece of meat. He came up off the floor of the world. He opened the mouth that had been shut on his own tail for centuries. He took it, and the hook went up through the roof of his mouth and set. Everything after that happened very fast, and both of them were surprised. But the serpent went down and away, the way anything hooked went. The line came tight, and it did not break, and the boat stood up on its bow. Thor braced. His feet went through the planking of the bottom, both of them. They went on down through the water below, and they came to rest on the sea floor. He hauled from there. The serpent came up, hand over hand, against everything he had. The water above him went the colour of iron. The whole surface of that part of the ocean began to boil, with fish going in every direction at once. Then the head came out of the water, and they looked at each other. That was all the meeting ever amounted to, and it lasted a few heartbeats, and it was the reason the poem was made. The serpent had his mouth full of an ox and a hook, and could not close it. He was in the air for the first time in his life, and the light was wrong, and everything hurt. And on the other end of the line there was a red-bearded man standing on the bottom of the sea in a broken boat, hauling. He had an expression on his face that no giant would ever want to see from 4 feet away. Venom came down out of the serpent's mouth into the water. Neither of them looked away, but Hymir cut the line. He had been sitting in the stern, going white for some time. He got out his bait knife, and he leaned forward, and he cut through the line at the gunwale. His own boat was coming apart. There was a thing in the water beside it, the length of a fjord. The serpent went down. He went down like a cliff falling, and the sea closed over him. The wave from it ran a long way and put water over the low islands. Thor hit the giant once and put him over the side, and then he waded home. The poem had no further interest in Hymir. The serpent went back to the floor of the world with a hook in the roof of his mouth and a hole in his tongue. He found his tail in the dark, and he took it up again, and he shut his mouth on it, and he lay still. He had been asleep for a very long time, and now he was not. Something had been begun out there in the boat that nobody had intended to begin, and it had gone both ways. They had measured each other. They would not meet a third time until the water came inland. And the sea closed flat over the whole of it before evening, the way it always did. The boat was gone, and the giant was gone. There was nothing on the surface anywhere to show that any of it had happened. Part 6. The Ironwood, the wolf on the island, had sons, and the gods found that out too late to do anything about it. He had been in Asgard for 3 years, and out at the Ironwood before that. Nobody had thought to ask what a young animal did with its time. By the season they rowed him out to Lyngvi. There were already wolves in the east that had come out of him. They were growing, and nobody in Asgard knew a single one of their names. The binding had been very thorough. It had also been about 9 years late. Nothing grew in the Ironwood that a man would have called a tree. They had the shape of trees, and they had the height of them. They stood in rows the way a planted wood stood, and that was the worst part of it. The trunks were black, and they had a grain in them like hammered metal. When two of them touched in a wind, they made a low sound. The sound carried, and it did not stop where it should have stopped. Nothing had leaves. There was no bird song in that forest at any hour, and nothing crossed the ground. There was no smell of rot anywhere either. Nothing in there had ever finished dying. The floor of it was iron scale and old ash, packed hard with no track worn into it from any direction. And in the middle of it there was a clearing with a fire, and an old woman sitting at the fire. She had been sitting there longer than the gods had been keeping records. Nobody used her name if they could avoid it. The oldest poem, the North Maid, called her only the Old One in Ironwood, and left it at that, which was a kind of caution. She fed the fire. She sat with her hands in her lap between one piece of wood and the next. And she bred wolves in that clearing, one litter and then another litter. It went on and on without hurry, the way another woman might have kept bees. She bred them in the shape of men, which was the part that frightened people. That was the phrase the poem used, and it never explained itself. And every generation that heard it understood something slightly different by it. Some said the wolves went about on 2 legs when there was nobody to see. Some said they came into farmsteads in the winter as guests. They sat at the fire and ate what was put in front of them. They were only found out by the way they never once looked at the door. What the poem meant, most likely, was simpler and worse. It meant she was raising them the way a woman raised children, on purpose, with a plan, over a very long time. All of that brood came out of the wolf on the island, and the poem said so plainly. They were called the seed of Fenrir. The old woman was their nurse and their keeper, and the fire in the clearing was the only warm thing any of them ever knew. They came out of that wood a few at a time over centuries. They went west and north into places where the winters were bad and the people were thin on the ground. Most of them stayed on the earth. They killed livestock. They were hunted, and sometimes they were caught, but 2 of them were not put on the earth at all. 2 of them were sent up, but the sun and the moon in the north were not fires and they were not stones. The north was clear about that, and quite unusual in it. They were a woman and her brother. They had been alive, and they were still alive up there. Their father had been a man called Mundilfari, who had 2 beautiful children and could not keep his mouth shut about it. He named the girl Sol after the sun and the boy Mani after the moon. He said it in company. He said it more than once. The gods took the 2 of them away from him for that. They did not kill them, which would have been a smaller thing than what they did. They put them to work. They set the girl in the chariot that carried the sun across the sky. They set the boy in the chariot that carried the moon. They told them both the hours, and then they left them to it. Neither of them ever came down again. The horses were called Arvak and Alsvid, which meant the early waker and the all-swift. They pulled the sun, and the sun burned, and the horses would have been dead within a day of starting. So the gods set bellows of cold iron under the shoulders of both animals, which worked as they ran and blew cold up along their sides. A shield was hung on the front of the chariot as well, between the fire and the world, and it was called Svalin, the cooler. Everything alive underneath it lived because of that one board. If Svalin ever slipped, the poem said the sea would burn and the mountains would burn with it. and behind the chariot, from the beginning, there was a wolf. There was a second wolf behind the moon, at the same distance, doing the same work. Those were the terms of it, and they had been set before anyone was watching. Neither of the two drivers had been told about it in advance. They found out the way anybody found out they looked behind them. That was why the sun went fast. That was the entire reason. It had nothing to do with the turning of anything, or the will of the gods, or the order of the world. A young woman was driving a burning cart across the sky as hard as two horses could pull it. She did it every day for the whole of her life. There was an animal behind her that had never once stopped and never once fallen further back. She did not gain on it, she could not lose it. The distance stayed the distance, hour after hour, year after year. There was no possible outcome to the arrangement except one, and everybody involved knew what it was. The two wolves were called Sköll and Hati, and Hati was named the son of Fafnir, which was another name for the wolf on the island. But the old tellings would not agree on which wolf ran behind which light. They never did agree, and it was not a small disagreement. One poem set Sköll behind the sun and gave the moon to Hati. Another put it the other way about, and the wording of that poem made better sense of the genders. The sun was a woman, and the moon was a man, and a third telling gave the moon to a wolf called Manigam, the moon hound. It said he was the strongest of the whole brood in the Ironwood. It said he would fill himself with the flesh of everyone who died. Nobody ever reconciled them, and nobody at the time seemed to feel any need to. The North was not a place that wrote things down and then checked them against each other. A man in Upland told it one way because his grandmother had told it that way. A man 4 days' sail west told it the other way. If the two of them had ever met, they would have argued about it for one evening. Then they would have agreed that there were two wolves and that both of them were still up there, which was the part that mattered. And a few times in a lifetime the distance closed. It happened without warning in the middle of an ordinary day. The light went wrong first, thin and the colour of iron, and the birds went quiet, and the cattle turned for home hours early. Then the edge of the sun began to go. Everyone who could walk came out of the houses. They brought whatever would make a noise. They beat on pots and struck the flats of axes against shield rims. They hammered the sides of the byres and called up at the sky. The children called out because everyone else was calling out. And it worked. That was the thing. It worked every single time. The dark came on and stopped and went back the other way. The light came up thin and then ordinary, and the birds started again. Somebody laughed the way people laughed when they had decided not to say what they were thinking. Then everyone went back to work. Nobody made a speech about it. A woman who had been beating a pot with a ladle put the ladle down. She went in and finished making the meal she had been making. But the wolves did not stop, and they were not driven off, and they had never been driven off. They had simply come nearer than usual and then gone back to their proper distance. It was the distance they had kept since the first morning of the world. It was a good distance. It was wide enough that a person standing in a field would never see either animal at all, and none of them ever did. And it was closing the whole time by an amount far too small for any eye to measure in a sky that gave no sign of it whatsoever. Part 7, the root and the tooth. Everyone in the 9 worlds spent a great deal of time looking up, and almost none of them ever looked down. The wolves in the sky were visible. That was their entire advantage. A man could stand in a field and be frightened of a thing he had never seen, because the light told him it was there. Nothing told anybody about the other one. There was no weather for it, and no sign in the sky, and no noise that carried up as far as a farm. It had been working away underneath the world since before the sky had anything in it worth chasing. The tree held everything up, and it had 3 roots, and each root went somewhere different. The first went up under Asgard, and the well beneath it was Urd's well. 3 women lived by that well. They drew water every day and poured it over the bark so that the trunk would not rot. That was the good root. The second went east under the country of the frost giants, and Mimir's well stood beneath that one. There was wisdom in the water, and it would cost an eye to drink. The third went north and down into Niflheim, into the cold and the mist. It ended above a spring called Vergelmir, which meant the roaring kettle. 11 rivers came out of that spring, and they were all cold, and there was a dragon lying under the root. His name was Níðhöggr, and the name meant the one who strikes in malice, and there was nothing in it about hunger. He had been there before anybody thought to look. No telling ever said where he came from, and no god ever put him there. There was no story anywhere of a first day on which he arrived and began. He was simply under the 3rd root, in the dark, at the roaring kettle, doing the one thing he did. He was chewing the root. He had been chewing it since the tree went into the ground. He did not chew it in bouts, and he did not chew it in anger, and he never once made progress worth measuring. He worked at it the way water worked at a headland. A little of the wood came away and went down into the black water below. The tree would put out a little more from the inside. The 2 of them had been in that arrangement for the whole of the world's existence, with neither one ahead. The old poem said a thing about the tree that most people passed over quickly. It said that the ash suffered more hardship than men knew. It said a heart bit it from above, and the sides of it rotted, and Níðhöggr tore at it from beneath. That was all. It was 3 lines in a list set between other lists. The greatest object in creation was in constant pain from 3 directions at once, and it went on standing. The poem gave it 3 lines and moved on to something else. And a little way from the root on the far side of the mist, there was a shore. The shore was called Nastrond, which meant the strand of corpses, and it faced away from the sun. The beach of it was black grit, and the water that came up onto it did not move like ordinary water. There was a hall standing there. The walls of it were braided out of the spines of snakes, wound in and out like wattle. Every head had been turned inward so that it looked into the room. It had no fire, and it had no benches. The smoke hole in the roof let nothing out. What came in through it was venom, running down steadily all day and all night into the hall. The floor of that hall was a river of it, and there were people wading in the river. They were oath-breakers and murderers and men who had gone to other men's wives. Those were the 3, and the poem named them in that order, and it did not name any other kind. Nobody in the north was sent to Nastrond for being weak or unlucky or poor. Nobody went there for dying badly. A great many extremely violent men never saw the place at all. It was a hall for people who had broken faith with somebody who had trusted them. Nothing else was needed to get in, and that said a good deal about what the north was frightened of. And Níðhöggr came up to that shore to feed when there was feeding. He came off the root and out along the black grit, and he took the bodies of the dead there. The old words for what he did to them were the words for sucking rather than the words for eating. It would have been tidier to make him the jailer of that place. But no poem ever gave him a duty or an office, and nobody set him over the dead as a punishment for anything. He had been eating before there was any such thing as an oath to break. That was all it came to. The gods had made a place to put the men who broke faith. They had put it on a shore where a thing already lived that would eat whatever was left lying about. The arrangement worked, so it stood and it would go on standing. After a few hundred years, everybody was calling it justice. Níðhöggr had no opinion on the matter. He had never had one about anything. Part 8. The squirrel, the strangest creature on the whole of that tree, was not the dragon at the bottom. Up at the crown of it, so far above the root that no measurement of the distance was ever attempted, there was an eagle. The poems never gave him a name, which was unusual, and which nobody ever explained. He sat at the top of the world with his wings folded and looked out over everything. He knew a great deal. He was never once described as doing anything with what he knew. Between his eyes there was a hawk sitting in the feathers, and the hawk had a name, and it was Fafnir. And running between the two of them up and down the whole length of the trunk there was a squirrel. He was called Ratatoskra, which meant something close to drill-tooth. He was the only creature in the story that had seen both ends of it. He went up the bark to the eagle, and he came down the bark to the dragon. He did it over and over all day without stopping for the entire life of the world. Nobody fed him, nobody had asked him to start, and nobody would ever ask him to stop. What he carried up and down was insults. That was his work. And the poem was completely straightforward about it. He took the eagle's words down to Níðhöggr. He took Níðhöggr's words back up to the eagle. He did not soften either of them on the way. By every indication he improved them slightly. The message repeated 800,000 times by a creature who enjoyed the carrying would not stay the same message. But no telling anywhere recorded what the original quarrel was about. Nobody knew. The eagle did not know. The dragon at the bottom of the tree had been chewing the root and hating a bird he had never seen. He had done it for so long that the reason had worn out of the story entirely. The hating had gone on quite happily without it. Every day the squirrel came down the trunk with something new and unforgivable. Every day the dragon sent something worse back up. And the tree that both of them lived on went on holding the sky apart from the sea. But the rest of what lived on that tree simply ate it. There were 4 hearts up in the high branches, and they were named Dane and Dverlin, Dunir and Durathor. They went along the topmost shoots with their heads up, taking the new growth, which was the growth the tree had just made. Below them the trunk was rotting at the sides in the ordinary way of old wood. Below that, again there was the root. It was eaten at the crown and eaten at the middle and eaten at the bottom. 4 deer and time and a dragon all at once on every day there had ever been. And on the roof of Valhalla there were 2 more of them, and those 2 were the reason anybody put up with the rest. A goat stood up there called Hydron, and she cropped the branches of a tree named Larad that grew against the hall. What came out of her was not milk, it was mead. It came in such quantity that it would fill a vessel below her every day. There was enough in it for every dead man in the building, and there was never a morning when there was not enough. Beside her stood a stag called Eithonir, browsing the same branches. Water ran off the points of his antlers and went down into Hvergelmir, the roaring kettle at the bottom of the world, which meant that the water in the spring beneath the dragon had come off the antlers of a deer on a roof. Everything on that tree fed something else on that tree, and none of it had been designed. The whole arrangement had the look of a thing that had simply settled. Nothing in it could be removed, and nothing ever would be. The mead in Valhalla and the venom on Nastrond came out of the same trunk. The gods had built their hall in the branches of it, and the dead lay along the roots of it. The distance between those two facts was smaller than anybody living in the branches liked to think about. But the tree stood, and it went on standing, and it was in pain the entire time. The poem had already said so in 3 lines, and it did not say it again. At the bottom of it, in the mist, the 11 rivers came up cold out of the roaring kettle and went away north. The root came down through the roof of that place, pale where it had been worked at, and darker further along. And under it, in the dark, with the water going by and the squirrel due back down at any moment, there was a sound. It was the sound of something chewing patiently at a thing far too large to finish. Part 9, Gnipahellir. The route did not end at the roaring kettle, and neither did the road. It went on past the spring, and it went on down. That was the direction everything took at that depth. There was nothing at the bottom of the world that climbed, and nothing that turned back, and there was only ever the one way to go. A man who had somehow walked down as far as the dragon and kept walking would have come out of the mist in time. He would have come onto a made road with the marks of a great deal of traffic on it. The road was called the Hellway, and it took 9 nights to ride. That was the figure the poems gave, and they gave it more than once. It was always 9, and it was always nights rather than days. There was no daylight down there to count in. The road went downward the whole distance, and it went northward at the same time. The country on both sides of it stopped having features after the first night. It was not frightening country, and nobody ever expected that of it. It was flat, and it was cold, and it went on. After a while there was nothing on it to look at except the road. The valleys got deeper and darker as it went, and then it came to the water. The river was called Gjöll, and it ran fast, and there were knives in it. That was how the old poem put it, and it did not soften the image. The river of the underworld ran with edges in it, turning over in the current. The sound it made carried a long way, in country that had nothing else in it to make a sound. Over the river there was a bridge, and the bridge was roofed with gold. That was the detail that stopped everybody. It was the only beautiful thing on the entire road. It was 7 days down, and there was nobody to admire it. It shone in a country with no light source anybody ever identified. It rang under a horse's hooves louder than 5 living men riding together. It had been built to a standard that nothing else down there came anywhere near. A woman kept that bridge, and her name was Modgud, and she counted. She stood at the near end of it, and she asked the dead who they were and whose people they came from. She wrote nothing down, she simply knew the number. She knew how many had crossed that day and how many that year. She had been standing there long enough that the question had stopped being a challenge and had become a courtesy. But she was not a guard. Nothing that came down that road had ever needed to be stopped. She was closer to a woman at a door in a hall, counting the guests in so that the household would know how much bread to set out. Past the bridge the road turned north and downward again, and it ran on until it came to a wall. The gate in that wall had 2 names, and neither of them was pleasant. It was called the Corpse Gate. It was also called the Gate of Hell. It was high, and it was shut. It had been shut for as long as there had been anything on the other side of it to shut in. There was no keeper standing at it, and there was no lock on it that anybody ever described. But there was a dog, a little to one side of the gate. In the rock face there was a cave, and the cave had a name. It was Gnipahellir, the overhanging cave, and the hound was chained in the mouth of it. He was chained well. The old poem said the fetters would burst before the end. Somebody had thought hard about them then, the way somebody had once thought hard about a ribbon. His breast and his forelegs were wet with blood, and no poem ever said whose. That was the whole description. 4 or 5 words in a language people went on reading for 1,000 years, and no story anywhere attached to them. Nothing was ever recorded as having tried to get past him. The dead came down the road in their hundreds and went in through the gate. Not one of them was ever recorded as being touched. And yet the animal at the door was always freshly blooded every time anybody looked, in a place where nothing living came and nothing dead resisted. And the same poem that put the blood on him called him the best of hounds. That was not a mistake, and it was not irony. It came in a list of bests. The best of trees was the ash, the best of ships was Skidbladnir, the best of horses was Sleipnir, and the best of hounds was Glam. The poet who set that down did not pause over it and did not qualify it. Of every dog that had ever lived, the one chained at the corpse gate with blood down his chest was the finest. The North meant it, and the North knew what it was saying. They knew exactly what a good dog was. They lived with them and worked them and were fed by them. They put them in the ground with their people so often that the graves would still be full of them long afterwards. A man was buried with his horse and his dog. A woman was buried with her dog. Children were buried with dogs laid along their legs. It was not decoration, and it was not sacrifice in any resentful sense. It was the single most obvious thing in the world to do, which was to send somebody down that road with the animal that had walked beside them on all the other roads. And then they set the best of all dogs at the far end of it, chained in a cave in the dark. It followed perfectly, and it was bleak, and nobody in the North seemed to find it strange. A road that long would need a dog at the end of it. That was all. The dead were coming down in the dark for 9 nights in a country with nothing in it, and the last thing before the gate was the sound of something that knew they were coming. There were people who bound shoes onto the feet of their dead for that walk. They were called hell shoes. A man would be laid out and washed. Then somebody would tie proper shoes onto his feet and knot them well. The road was long, and the ground on it would be hard. It was done in Iceland within living memory of the sagas being written down. It was done by people who fully intended to go on with ordinary daylight. They tied the shoes and they said what was said. Then they went back to the farm and got on with the winter. Some of the tellings could not keep Glam and the wolf apart, and it was not obvious that they had been trying to. The hound at the gate was chained, and the wolf on the island was bound. Both of them would come loose at the same hour. Both of them were promised the death of a god. One poem set Glam howling before the cave in the same breath in which the wolf came free. Some who told it in later centuries simply said the two were one animal seen from opposite ends of the world. Nobody ever settled it. The North was entirely comfortable with a thing being two things, and it never once felt the need to tidy that up for anybody. But the line that the poem used about him was not a description at all. It was a bell. 3 times in the old prophecy the same words came back in the same order, always at a turn, and they were these. Now Glam howls loud before Gnipahellir. The fetters will burst and the wolf run free. It came in the middle of a list of ordinary horrors, and it did not explain itself. It did not need to. Everybody listening knew that the day the dog at the bottom of the world began to bark would be the last day of everything above him. He had not barked yet. That was the point of the line. It was written in a tense that had not arrived, so the road ran on down in the dark with nobody on it. The gold bridge stood over the water with the knives going by underneath. The woman at the near end of it kept her count. The gate stayed shut and the wall stood, and off to one side of it the mouth of the cave was a slightly darker shape in a dark rock face, with a chain running back into it, and the animal at the end of the chain lying with his head on his paws, entirely quiet, waiting for a morning that was still a long way off. Part 10. The Otter's ransom. Every creature in the story so far had been put where it was by somebody else. The wolf was bound because the gods bound him. Jormungandr went into the sea because a god dropped him in it. The wolves in the sky were set, running behind the lights. The hound was chained at the gate. Even the dragon under the root had simply been there doing what it did without ever choosing anything. Not one of them had been asked, but there was one that did it to himself on purpose over a period of years while he could still have stopped. There was a farm inland with a waterfall on it, and a man on the farm called Hreidmar. He was not a giant, and he was not a god. He was a landholder with some knowledge of the old arts, and he had 3 grown sons, and none of the 3 were ordinary. The eldest was Otr. He could take the shape of an otter, and he did it nearly every day. He spent his afternoons at the falls catching fish and eating them on the bank with his eyes shut. The second was Regin, who was a smith, and the finest that country had produced in living memory. The third was Fafnir, and Fafnir was the biggest and the strongest and the least talked about. 3 travellers came along that road in the afternoon, on foot, in ordinary clothes. They were Odin and Hoenir and Loki, going about on one of those journeys the gods took when they wanted to see the world at ground level. They came to the falls. There was an otter on the bank with a salmon in its paws, eating with its eyes closed, entirely absorbed. Loki picked up a stone. He threw it, and it went home, and the otter died where it sat. He was extremely pleased with the throw. He said he had taken 2 animals with 1 stone. He skinned the otter, and he carried the skin along with him for the rest of the day. They asked for lodging that evening at the nearest farm, which was Hreidmar's. Loki showed the skin. He showed it the way a man showed a good day's work to a stranger, expecting to be admired for it. The farmhouse went very quiet. Then Hreidmar called his 2 remaining sons in from the yard. The 3 of them took the gods and bound them, because between them they were more than enough. But the price was set that night, and it was set precisely. The skin was to be stuffed full of gold. Then it was to be laid down and covered over with gold on every side until not 1 hair of it could be seen from any angle. That was all. It sounded almost reasonable, which was what made it a good price. Hreidmar had thought of it, and he was a careful man. Loki was let out to fetch it, and he knew exactly where to go. He went to the sea, and he borrowed a net from Ran, who kept one for drowned men. He carried it back inland to another waterfall, a long way off, where a dwarf called Andvari lived in the water in the shape of a pike. Andvari had been down there a very long time, and he had accumulated a great deal. Loki put the net in and took him on the first cast. He held him up, and he did not put him down until they had come to an arrangement. He took all of it. He took every coin and every arm ring and every cup down to the sweepings. And when it was all out of the rock and stacked, the dwarf kept one thing back. It was a ring, and its name was Anvaronot, and there was nothing about it to look at twice. Loki saw him close his hand on it. He made him open the hand. He took the ring, and he put it with the rest, and he turned to go. Then the dwarf spoke from the water, and what he said was short. He said the gold would be the death of whoever held it. He said the ring would be the death of every man who owned it, one after another, without exception, for as long as there was anybody left to own it. Then he went back down into the falls, and no story would ever mention him again. Loki carried the gold home, and he was in an excellent humour the whole way. He had been given a curse to hand somebody, and he had a very good idea who. They stuffed the skin, and they built the gold up over it, and then they stood back. One whisker was still showing. It was on the muzzle near the end, and it was one hair, and Fredmar walked round the heap twice and pointed at it without saying anything. Odin had kept the ring. He had liked the look of it, in the way a man liked a thing he had decided not to examine. He took it off, and he laid it over the whisker, and the debt was paid. Then he told them what the ring was, because there was no rule that said he had to do it kindly. He told them the gold was cursed and the ring was cursed. He told them the curse would take the owner and then the next owner, and that it had already started. Then the three of them walked out and went on with their journey. What happened afterwards in that house happened over about 4 months, and it happened exactly as promised. Regin and Fafnir asked their father for a share, since it had been their brother. Hreidmar refused. He did not do it cruelly. He simply said no, in the way a man said no to a thing already decided. He would go on sitting up at night with the gold in the room with him, sleeping less than he used to. Regin asked twice more. Fafnir did not ask again. Fafnir went in one night while his father was asleep and killed him with a sword. That was the first payment the ring took, and it would take a great many more. It was made by a man who had not been an unusual man 3 months earlier. He took everything. When Regin came to him afterwards and asked for a half or a third or anything at all, Fafnir told him to be glad he had a life to leave with. Regin left with a life and nothing else. He walked south. He took up work as a smith at a king's court, and he waited 18 years. Part 11. The man who chose the shape, Fafnir, carried the gold up onto a high heath called Níðhöggr, and he lay down on it. That was all he did. There was no spell involved, no god cursed him with a body, and no dwarf turned him into anything. The ring had done nothing to him except make him willing. He carried the gold up to open ground where nobody had a farm. He put it in a hollow in the rock, and he lay down on top of it. Then he stayed there. The first year a shepherd could still have gone up and had a conversation with him. He was a big man lying on a heap of metal on a hill. He would be rude to anybody who came up. He came down himself twice in that year to take a sheep. People talked about him the way they talked about any man who had gone strange after a death in the family. There was still a name for what he was, and nobody had yet started calling him anything else. The change came on the way weather came on. It came slowly, and then all at once, and then permanently. His shoulders went first. They thickened across the top, and they kept thickening. After a while they did not come down again when he relaxed. There was no relaxing left in them. Then the skin along his back began to harden in patches, and the patches spread and joined, and what came up through them was plate. It was not armour, and he had not put it on. It grew out of him the way a nail grew from underneath. It was the same colour all over, and it did not shine. His hands took longer, and he watched them do it. That was the part with the most in it. He could see his own hands from where he lay, and he had years in which to see them. They changed by such small amounts that no single day showed anything. The fingers shortened. The nails came forward and thickened at the root. The joints stopped moving the way joints were meant to move. There came a season when he could no longer close a hand around a sword hilt. It was the sword he had killed his father with. He left it lying where it was, a few feet away, in the rock. And there was a last time he stood up, and he did not know it was the last time. That had been true of every last time, and it was true of this one. He got up onto his back legs for some reason nobody recorded in some ordinary week. He stood there for a moment. Then he came down onto all four again. He never got up again, and no telling anywhere said that he tried. The voice went last, and it never went entirely. That was the strangest thing about him, and it was the reason the story had an ending at all. He could still speak. He spoke the same language he had spoken as a man. The voice had thickened and dropped and gone somewhere down into the chest. But it had kept its grammar and its manners and its intelligence. Anybody who came up onto that heath and heard it would have understood every word. Very few of them stayed long enough to answer, but he did nothing whatever with the gold. It sat under him in the hollow, and it would not move again for 18 years, and none of it was ever spent on anything. He did not build with it, he did not buy land or men or a hall or a wife or a single hour of anybody's good opinion. He had killed his father for it, and he had driven off his brother for it. Then he lay down on it for the rest of his life. The total sum of the use he got out of it was that it lay underneath him and not underneath anybody else. He had one thing he wore, and it was not a treasure. It was called the Ægisjalma, the helm of terror, and it was not a helmet in the ordinary sense. It was something he could put on and turn outward. Anything that came up the slope with a weapon met it before it met him. A grown man would find he had turned round and gone back down before he had decided to. It worked on everybody. Men came up onto Níðhöggr fairly often in the first years in 1s and 2s for the gold. It worked on all of them. The story was quite specific, that it never failed right up until the day it did. And in the end there was a track worn into the heath, going down to the water. He drank at a stream at the bottom of the slope, and he went down to it at the same hour each day. After enough years, the track would become a permanent feature of that landscape. It was as wide as a road and deeper than a road, worn down through the heather into the soil and then into the rock beneath. Nothing grew in it, along both edges of it. The grass was dead in a band a few feet across, killed by what came off him as he passed. It stayed dead all year. It marked the whole length of his route across that hill, like a line drawn on a map. But he knew exactly what he had become, and that was where the horror of him sat. He was not confused, and he was not mad. There was never a moment when he forgot that he had once had hands and a father and a brother and a name that meant a man. He simply lay on the gold in the sun on the top of that heath, in the deep, quiet, with his chin on the rock. He had stopped minding some considerable time ago. He would lie there for 18 years, and he was not disturbed, and nothing came up the slope that the helm could not turn. But a long way south of that heath there was a hall he had never heard of. In it, a smith with a grievance was raising a boy who had lost his father before he was born. The smith was teaching him letters and languages and how to hold a blade, and he had begun very carefully and over a long period to tell him a story about a hill in the north. Part 12. The pit. Regin told the boy about the gold for 18 years, and he told it well, and he never once told it quickly. The boy was called Sigurd. His father had been killed before he was born, and he had been raised at the court of another king. Regin was his foster father and his tutor. He taught him letters and languages and chess and courtesy. He also taught him, a little at a time, that there was a heath in the north with a great deal of gold on it. He taught him that a creature lay on the gold, and that the creature had once been the tutor's own brother. He put that last part in early. It was the part that made the rest sound like a debt rather than a robbery. The sword took 3 attempts, and the first 2 broke on the anvil. Regin made a good blade, and Sigurd broke it. Regin made a better one, and Sigurd broke that as well, and the pieces went across the smithy floor. Then Sigurd went to his mother and asked for the fragments of his father's sword. She had kept them in a chest for 20 years without ever saying why. Regin welded those, and what came off the anvil that time was called Glam. It split the anvil down to the block, but the sword was not really the point of what happened on the heath. It mattered only as a thing that fitted into a hole in the ground. The plan was a pit, and it was Regin's plan, and it was a good one. The dragon came down the same track to the same water at the same hour every day, and he had been doing it for 18 years. He weighed what he weighed. He went down the track on his belly, and the belly was the only part of him with nothing over it. So a man might dig a hole in the middle of that track and get into it and wait. The whole animal would pass over him at arm's length, with nothing between them. Sigurd dug it himself, and while he was digging, an old man came along the heath. He had one eye and a broad hat. He stopped at the edge of the pit and looked into it, the way a man stopped at any hole another man was digging. He asked what it was for. Sigurd told him. The old man said that one pit was not enough. He said that when a creature of that size was opened from underneath, what came out of it would come out in quantity. He said a man standing in a single hole would drown in the middle of his own success. He said to dig several and to lead the blood away into the others. Then he walked on across the heath, and by the time Sigurd looked up again, there was nobody in sight in any direction. So he dug the other pits, and he got down into the middle one, and he waited in the dark. It was cold in there, and it smelled of turned earth. He could see a strip of sky the width of his shoulder. There was a long time of nothing at all. He heard his own breathing, and the wind going over the top of the trench. Then there was a change in the light, and then the ground began to move. It came over him, and he put the sword up into it, and the killing was over. The oldest telling did it in one line, and there was no reason to do it in more. He drove Glam up to the hilt into the underside as it passed, and he drew it along, and the thing above him opened. What came down into the pits came down hot and in enormous volume. The old man on the road had been right about it. Sigurd got out along a trench that was already filling. The animal went on a few lengths further down the track. Then it stopped on its side in the heather, and then it spoke, and that was why anybody remembered it at all. The voice came out, thickened and slow, and it was still the voice of somebody who could hold a conversation. He asked who had done it. Sigurd did not give his name at first. A dying man's curse was thought to carry, and a man who did not know a name could not aim it. He said only that he was called the noble beast, that he had no mother and no father, and that he had come alone. But the dragon said that he was lying, and asked again, and this time he was answered. Sigurd said his name and his father's name, and what the dying animal did with that was not what anybody in the story expected. He did not curse him. He asked about the family, and he was told, and he said that they were a good line. Then he began to talk about the gold at some length. He talked in the tone of a man who had thought about very little else for a long time and had finally been given somebody to say it to. He told him to leave it. That was the advice entire, and he gave it plainly. He said the gold would be the death of him. He said it had been the death of every man who had held it. He said the same of every man who held it afterwards. He said the ring in particular would take him. He named Regin as well. He said his brother had sent the boy to do this and would want the boy dead the moment it was done. Regin had killed one man out of that family already. He would not find the second one difficult, but every word of it was true. It was said by the least trustworthy creature on the heath, and Sigurd did not take any of it. He said that any man would take the gold and that a man died only once. Then the dragon stopped answering and the heath was quiet. There was a very large dead thing lying across a track in the heather, with the smell of it going a long way downwind. But Regin came down off the ridge where he had been standing the whole time. He drank some of the blood. Then he cut out the heart and gave it to Sigurd. He asked him to roast it while he slept, because he said he needed to lie down. He lay down in the heather a little way off with his back turned. Sigurd built a fire and put the heart on a spit over it and turned it. After a while he put a thumb on the meat to see whether it was done. It was, and it burned him. He put the thumb in his mouth. And the birds in the branches above the fire stopped being birds and started being voices. There were not hatches up there, and they were talking about him. They were saying that the man asleep in the heather was going to kill him as soon as he woke up. They were saying it in the way birds said anything, without malice and without any interest in the outcome. They said he should eat the heart himself. They said he should take the gold and go. They said there was a mountain to the south with a fire round it, and a woman asleep inside the fire, and that he ought to go there instead. He got up and killed Regin where he lay, and it took him no time at all. That was the second death out of that family, and the ring was not finished. It had taken Hreidmar in his bed, and Fafnir on the track, and Regin in the heather. It would take Sigurd himself, then it would go on and take a queen and a king and 2 children, and a whole royal house 4 countries away, and it would still not be done. Nothing had been lifted off it. The curse had simply changed hands, which was the only thing it had ever done and the only thing it ever did. Sigurd loaded the gold onto his horse, and the horse did not want to carry it. Grani was Sleipnir's own descendant, and there was very little in the world that troubled him. He stood on the track in the late afternoon with the load going onto his back. He put his ears back, and he would not move off. Sigurd had to mount and ride him before he took a step. And then the 2 of them went down off Níðhöggr in the last of the light. They went past the dead grass on both sides of the track, with the gold on the horse and the ring on the man's hand, going south towards a mountain with a fire on it. Part 13. The Mound, the dragon, had been one man on one hill who made one decision and then lived with it for 18 years. What came next was not like that. It was not rare, and it was not remarkable, and it did not require anybody to be exceptional. It happened on farms, in valleys, people could name to men whose fathers were known. It happened within the memory of the grandmothers of the men who wrote it down. Nobody who told these stories thought of them as stories. They gave the farm, they gave the year, they gave the names of the men who had been there and could be asked. A barrow was not a hole in the ground, it was a house, and it was furnished. The dead man was set inside it sitting up, or laid out in a boat. The things that went in with him were the things he had used. His good axe went in, his cup went in, his horse was killed and put in with him, and his dog was laid along his legs. If he had been a man of standing, there might be a whole ship dragged up from the shore and set in the earth around him. Then the mound was raised over the top, and turf was laid on it. After 2 summers it would look like a small green hill that had always been there. The whole arrangement rested on one assumption, which nobody in the north ever stated aloud, because nobody needed to. The assumption was that the man inside would stay in it. He had a house now, he had his things, he had been given everything he was owed. The account had been settled properly in front of witnesses, and there was no reason on earth for him to come out. Almost all of them did stay. The sagas only ever wrote down the exceptions, and the exceptions were extremely rare. Everybody else lay quiet under the turf for 1,000 years and gave nobody any trouble at all. But some of them came out, and the north had 2 separate words for them, and the difference between the words mattered enormously. One of them was the Hafgufa, the mound dweller. He stayed in. He sat in his own barrow in the dark with his things around him. He was dangerous only to men who came in after his gold, which men regularly did. Hafgufa was in some sense within his rights. He had been given a house, and he was defending it, and every farmer in Iceland would have said the same in his position. The other one was the draugar, and the draugar came out and walked. Draugar, in the plural, were what a whole district talked about in the winter. He came out at night, at first, and later he came out in daylight as well, which was the sign that things had gone very badly wrong. He did not haunt in the way a ghost haunted. There was nothing thin about him and nothing transparent, and nobody ever walked through one. He was a body. He was the body out of the mound with the mould still on it. It could be hit, it could push a door in, it left prints in the snow. Saga after saga described him the same way, and the descriptions were unpleasantly consistent. He was blue-black, bla sem hell. The phrase went blue as death. It meant the colour a body took when the blood had settled in it. He was swollen. He was often described as bloated like a bull, and as being much larger dead than the man had been alive, which was a thing a body did. He was cold to touch. He was enormously heavy, so heavy that men could not shift him, and he was strong out of all proportion to anything he had been in life. And in nearly every account the last detail given was the eyes, and they were always open. The most famous of the ordinary ones was a man called Thorolf, who was known as Twistfoot. He was a farmer in the west of Iceland, and he was thoroughly disliked, and the saga did not soften it. He was greedy, and he was litigious, and he quarrelled with his neighbours over grazing for 30 years. He had a son called Onkel, who was everything he was not, and the 2 of them could not be in a room together. And one evening Thorolf came in from a bad-tempered day and sat down in his high seat and would not answer when he was spoken to. In the morning he was still sitting there, and he was dead, and his eyes were open. Nobody in that house would go near him from the front. Word was sent to Onkel, and Onkel rode over. What he did on arriving said more about the Norse view of the dead than any poem did. He went round behind his father's chair. He came at him from the back, so as not to pass in front of his face. He took hold of him from behind. He put his hands over the eyes and closed them, and only then did anybody else in the room move. And then they took the wall out. They would not carry him through the door. They broke a hole in the wall behind the seat, and they brought the body out through that, and afterwards they closed the hole up again. It was done so that the dead man would not learn the way. A body carried out of a house through its own door was thought to know that door afterwards. It would be able to find it again in the dark from a considerable distance, some months later. They buried him well up the valley, and they buried him deep. None of it worked. But it began with the birds. Everything that flew over the top of that cairn came down dead beside it, and it was noticed within a fortnight. Then the cattle in the nearest field began to go wrong. They would not be driven past the place. They stood in a corner facing away from it for whole days. Then one morning a number of them were found dead, and no cause could be given. Then the man who herded them was found dead on the ground with every bone in him broken. There were no marks on the earth around him except cattle tracks and one other set. After that the farm emptied, and then the valley did. It went the way these things always went, which was slowly and reasonably. The farmhands would not stay past the autumn. The nearest family moved to the coast for the winter and did not come back in the spring. Land went out of use and stayed out of use. Stock was moved 5 valleys over. Men who had been born there worked ground belonging to other people for the rest of their lives. A dead man had been buried in a valley, and now nobody could live in the valley, and the whole of that had happened in about 3 years. They would dig him up twice, and the first time they only moved the problem. Uncle came back with men, and they opened the cairn. Thorolf was lying in it, undecayed, black and swollen, and heavy as stone. They got him out with great difficulty and hauled him a long way off on an ox, and the ox died of it. They buried him again behind a headland where there was nothing worth walking to. That held for years. It held so long that people stopped talking about it, and Uncle himself died. Only after that did it start again. The second time it was worse, and it went further. So they did the other thing which everybody had known about the whole time and nobody had wanted to do. They opened a second grave, and they took him out, and they built a fire on the shore, and they burned him. He was very hard to burn. When it was done, they had a quantity of ash. They carried it out along the beach and put it into the sea. The men who did it went home and washed and said very little about it. That was the remedy. It was known everywhere in the north. It was always effective, and it was always the last thing anyone tried. Burning a man, cut him off from his mound and his things and his people for good. No family did that to one of their own until there was nothing else left. But a little of the ash blew back and lay along the shingle, and a cow ate the grass where it had settled. She was in calf that season. She dropped a bull calf, and the calf was a beautiful thing with a coat the colour of glass, and they called him Gleipnir. He grew faster than a calf should have grown. An old blind woman in the house heard him bellowing in the yard as a yearling and said out loud that they should kill him now. Nobody did, because he was a magnificent animal. He gored his owner in a field some years later and killed him. Then he went out into a bog and walked into it until it took him. That was how the North told it, and nobody who told it thought it was a story. The ash of one bad-tempered farmer had gone through a cow into a bull and out through a man in a field. The whole of it had taken about 20 years. Every farm along that coast could tell, whoever asked, exactly where each part of it had happened. That was the ordinary sort. That was a difficult neighbour who had died badly and had taken a valley with him. But there was one that was worse than Thorolf, and everybody in Iceland knew his name. They knew it because of what he did to the strongest man in the country. Part 14. Glam. There was a valley in the north of Iceland that already had something wrong with it before any of this began. It belonged to a farmer called Thorhall, and the farm was good land, and he could not keep a shepherd on it. They left in the autumn. Some of them left without their wages, which in that country meant a great deal. 1 or 2 had been found dead, and nothing had been proved about any of it. Thorhall went to the Althing every summer and asked around for a man, and every summer the answer took a little longer to come. One year a lawman told him there was a Swede looking for work. He said the valley would not trouble that one, and that it might get some trouble back. His name was Glam. He came over the hill in the autumn, and the household came out to look at him, because he was worth looking at. He was very large. His hair was wolf-grey, and it stood out from his head. His eyes were grey and set wide, and they did not settle on anything. He had a voice that carried across a valley without effort, and he used it constantly. He was rude to everybody in the house within the first hour, and he made the horses uneasy. The household did not like him at all, and never came to. But the sheep did well that autumn, and the valley left him alone, and Thorhall said nothing. Glam went out in weather that kept other men in. He came back at hours that suited him. He would not go to church, and he said so loudly, he said he had no use for what was sung there. He said he had heard it all before and had not been impressed the first time. Thorhall's wife stopped speaking to him. Thorhall kept paying him because the alternative was an empty farm. Then it came to Christmas Eve, and the household was fasting, and Glam wanted his meat. The woman of the house told him it was not to be eaten on that night. He told her he had never held with the custom, and he did not intend to start. She said that no good would come of it. He said he could see no difference in men who fasted, except that they were hungrier and no better tempered. Then he stood over the fire and ate what he wanted. He went out with the door open behind him, into weather that was coming down off the mountain. But he did not come back. The storm went on all that night and half the next day. When it cleared, men went out to look, and they went up the slope where the sheep were, and they found the ground first. There was an area of hillside where the snow and the frozen turf had been torn up and thrown about over a great distance. It looked as if 2 large animals had fought there for a long time. Then further up they found him. He was lying on his back, and he was black and swollen, and he was the size of an ox. That was the phrase the saga used, and it did not decorate it. The men who found him had known him 3 months, and they could not lift him. They went down for more men, and they came back up with a sledge, and they could not get him onto it either. They tried 3 times over 2 days. In the end they left him where he was and built a cairn over the top of him on the hillside. Nobody said the word out loud in front of anybody else. Every man on that slope knew exactly what had happened. Nobody ever found out what he had fought with, and the saga never said, "The haunting began before the end of the winter, and it began with the sound on the roof. He rode the house." That was the phrase for it, and no better one was ever found. In the night, something got up onto the roof of the hall and sat astride the ridge. It beat the heels down against the timbers, over and over, in no rhythm for hours. It was heavy. The whole building moved with it. Nobody inside slept, and nobody inside went out, and in the morning the timbers were cracked, and there was nothing on the roof. Then it got worse in the way these things always did, which was steadily and in the direction of the daylight. The cattle in the valley went first, and then the man who saw to them. 2 servants died in the house. Others walked out with their belongings and did not stop to be paid. The farm at Thorhallstadia stood empty in the end, except for Thorhall himself. He would not leave his own land, and he moved his bed further in every month. And after 2 winters of it, Glam was being seen in the middle of the afternoon on the road in full light. No one had ever heard of such a thing before. The valley emptied for the second time in 20 years, and then Grettir came. He was Grettir Asmundarson, and he was already famous. He was the strongest man in Iceland by common agreement, and he had a temper on him that had cost him a great deal. He was quarrelsome and unlucky and immensely brave, and he had a habit of going towards things. He rode up the valley in the autumn with the advice of several sensible people behind him, and he ignored all of it. He asked Thorhall for a bed in the hall, and he made his arrangements at the door. He lay down in his clothes on a bench with a cloak over him. He tucked one end of the cloak underneath him, and he braced his feet against a beam by the doorpost. Then he lay there in the dark with the fire down, and he waited, and the household was somewhere further in, not sleeping. But it came about 1/3 of the way through the night. There was the weight on the roof first, and the heels going, and then that stopped, which was worse. Then the outer door was pulled, and the frame went. Grettir did not move. The thing came in and stood in the middle of the hall. He could see the shape of the head against the smoke hole, up near the crossbeam, higher than a man's head had any business being. Then it came along the hall and took hold of the cloak and pulled. Grettir held on, and that was the beginning of the strangest wrestle in Icelandic literature. It was strange because of what Glam wanted. He was not trying to get in, and he was not trying to reach the house. He had hold of a man, and he was going the other way. Everything in that fight was Glam hauling backwards towards the door. Grettir set his heels and was dragged, foot by foot, down the length of his own chosen ground. Benches went over, the fire irons went. Grettir got a grip and lost it, and got another. The strongest man in the country was being taken out of a building against his will by something that had been a bad-tempered shepherd 2 years earlier. They went through the doorway together, and the doorway came with them. The frame tore out of the wall, and a good part of the wall came after it. The two of them went out into the yard in the middle of the wreckage and fell, and Grettir came down on top. That was the moment it turned. He had the weight and he had the leverage. He was, at last, the stronger of the two. Glam had stopped pulling and lay still underneath him. And then the clouds went off the moon. They had been fighting in the dark, and there was suddenly light in the yard, full and cold. Grettir was looking straight down into the face of the thing beneath him. He could not look away. The saga was completely clear about this, and it was the pivot of the whole book. He had beaten it, it was underneath him, and it was finished. And he lay there on top of it in the moonlight, unable to move his eyes, looking into a dead man's eyes that were open and moving. But then Glam spoke, and what he said took everything. He said Grettir had become famous for his strength. He said he would now grow no stronger, not by one hand's breadth, for the rest of his life. He said the luck he had would run out. He said he would be made an outlaw and would be driven to live alone. And then he said the part that finished him. He said that from this night Grettir would see in the dark the things that lived in it. He said his own eyes, the ones Grettir was looking into, would be before him always. He said he would find it hard to be alone in the dark, and that this would kill him. Grettir killed him properly after that, and it took the rest of the night. He cut the head off, and he set it against the buttocks, which was the way it was done, so that the thing could not use it. He burned the whole body on the hillside, and it took a long time and a great deal of wood. Then he carried the ash a long way off and put it into the ground, in a place with nothing near it. The valley was clear. Thorhall's farm was worked again the following year, and it gave no more trouble. The road was safe in daylight. Everything Grettir had come to do, he had done completely. But he had been the strongest man in Iceland at the start of that night, and he was never any stronger afterwards. He was outlawed within a few years, and he lived 19 years as an outlaw. He could not sleep without a light. He would not be left by himself once the sun went down. A man who had walked into an empty haunted valley on purpose would not cross a yard alone after dark. He went in the end to a small island off the north coast with his brother and one other man, because he could not be alone. He was killed there while he was ill and could not stand. Every other creature in this story was killed by the man who came for it, and stayed killed. Glam was cut up and burned and buried apart by a man who did all of it correctly, and Glam still won. It took him 19 years to finish, and he was in ashes for every one of them. That was the thing about the walking dead that the North understood and never spelled out. A wolf could be bound, and a dragon could be opened from underneath. But there was nothing at all to be done about a man who had died in a bad temper on the wrong night, and who had got a good long look at whoever came for him. And on an island off the north coast, years later, in the last of the light, 3 men built a fire up higher than 3 men needed. 2 of them thought nothing of it. The third sat close in against the heat, with his back to the rock and his eyes on the dark part of the water. He was a man who had never once in his life been afraid of the night, and he kept the fire going until morning. Part 15. The old cold ones, every creature so far had come along after the world was already standing. The wolf and the serpent were born into a world with halls in it. The dragon had been a farmer's son, the dead men had been neighbours. But there was an older order than any of them, and it had been there before the ground was, and some of it was still walking about. The first living thing had been a giant, and the world was made out of his body. His name was Ymir, and he came together out of the meltwater where the heat from the south ran into the ice from the north. He was not made by anyone. He fed, and he slept, and while he slept he sweated. Out of the sweat under his left arm came a man and a woman. One of his legs got a son on the other. That was the beginning, all of it. Then 3 brothers killed him, and no telling ever gave a reason for it. They took him apart and built with what they had. His flesh went to make the ground. His blood made the sea, and there was so much of it that it drowned the rest of his kind except 2. They set his bones up as the mountains and his teeth as the scree. They took the skull and put it over the top as the sky. They set a dwarf at each of the 4 corners to hold it up. His brains they threw into the air, and those were the clouds. Every cloud that ever crossed a field in that country had come off the inside of a dead giant's head, and in the flesh, while it lay there were maggots. The gods looked at them, then they gave them sense and shape and the wit of men, and sent them down to live in the rock underneath. Those were the dwarves. They were the finest makers in the 9 worlds. They forged the hammer and the ship and the ribbon and the spear, and they had begun as the things that got into a body while it was going off. But 2 of Ymir's kind lived through the flood, and everything cold came out of them. They were the frost giants, and their country was east and north of the settled world, and they were not one thing. Some of them were monstrous, some of them were farmers. Some were extremely beautiful, and the gods married a good many of them. Half of Asgard had giant mothers, which nobody in Asgard brought up more than necessary. The one they still told stories about was Hrungnir, and his head was made of stone. So was his heart, and it had 3 corners to it. The shape of it was carved on stones in the north for centuries afterwards by people who no longer remembered what it was. He owned a horse called Gulfaxi, the gold-maned. He was proud of that horse the way a man was proud of the one thing he owned that nobody could argue with. Odin rode past him one day on Gleipnir and did not stop. That was all it took. Hrungnir came after him. The 2 of them rode flat out all the way to the gates of Asgard, and the giant did not notice where he was until he was inside them. Since he was a guest, they gave him drink. He drank a great deal of it. Then he began to say what he was going to do. He would take Asgard apart and carry the whole of it away. He would sink the world in the sea. He would take Freyja and Idun home with him. He was still saying it when Thor came in through the door. They fought it out properly at an agreed place on an agreed day. The giants built a second man to stand beside him, because they wanted the odds. They made him out of clay, and he was 9 leagues high and 3 leagues across the chest. They could not find a heart big enough for him, so they put in the heart of a mare. He was called Mokakalfi. He stood there on the field, enormous, with the wind going round him. Then Thor came over the rise, and the clay man wet himself in front of everybody, and he was still doing it when the fighting started. Hrungnir was told that Thor would come at him from below, through the ground, and he believed it. So he laid his shield down flat and stood on top of it. He was standing on his own shield with nothing in front of him when the hammer came in over the ridge. He got his whetstone up, the 2 things met in the air, and the whetstone broke. Most of it went into the ground, and every whetstone quarry in the north was said to be a piece of it. 1 fragment went into Thor's head and stayed there. The hammer went on and took the stone head apart. The giant came down across Thor's neck, and it took a 3-year-old boy to lift the leg off him afterwards. Then there was Thiassi, who had a suit of eagle feathers and used it badly. He came down on 3 gods, cooking an ox in the open, and he sat in the tree above them and would not let the meat cook. He offered them a bargain and took the best of the ox. Then he took Loki as well, on the end of a pole, dragged through the tops of the trees with his arms coming out of their sockets. What he wanted was Idun and the apples that kept the gods from aging. He got her. Asgard went grey and stiff within the season. Nothing in the whole of that mythology was stranger than the picture of the gods sitting in their hall going old. They got her back, and Thiassi came after her, and he flew into a fire on the wall of Asgard and did not come out. His daughter came down afterwards in armour to collect the debt for him. Her name was Skadi, and she was given a husband and a laugh, and one thing more. Odin took her father's eyes and threw them up into the sky and made them into stars. It was a handsome gesture, and it was a very old one, and the North kept it. Every clear night afterwards there were 2 lights up there that had been in a dead giant's head. But there was one more of the old kind, and he sat further out than any of them. Nobody ever fought him, and no story was ever told with him in it. At the northern edge of everything, where the world stopped, there was a giant in the shape of an eagle, and his name was Helgr, the corpse swallower. He sat facing outward. He opened his wings and closed them slowly, and had done since before anybody was counting. And that was where wind came from, all of it. In every country, every day, off a bird nobody living had ever seen. Part 16. The beasts that were not monsters, not everything with 4 legs in that world was waiting to end it. The first of them came before the giants and before the gods, and she was a cow. Her name was Ordhumla, and she came out of the same meltwater Ymir did, and he fed on her. She fed on the salt in the ice. She licked at a block of it for 3 days. On the first day a man's hair came out of the salt. On the second day there was a head. On the third day the whole of him stepped out. He was called Buri, and Odin's father was his son. The gods came out of a cow's tongue and 3 days of patience. Then there was a stallion, and the stallion built a wall. A builder came to Asgard offering to raise a fortification, and he asked for the sun and the moon and Freyja. The gods took the wager because they were certain he would not finish. He had a horse called Svadilfari. The horse did the work. He hauled stone all night, more than any of them had believed a horse could haul, and with 3 days left the wall was very nearly closed. So Loki went out that evening in the shape of a mare and led the stallion off into the woods. The work stopped and the builder lost. 11 months later, Loki came back with a grey foal that had 8 legs. That was Gleipnir. He was the best horse in the 9 worlds, and he was given to Odin. He could go over land and water and down the road to the dead and back up it again. Every rider who ever saw him counted the legs. Nobody in any hall in the north ever asked out loud where the extra 4 had come from, and everybody knew. The dwarves made a boar out of a furnace, and he could outrun a horse. He was called Gullinbursti, the golden-bristled, and Freyr rode him. He went over air and over water as easily as over ground. There was no night dark enough to trouble him. The bristles on his back put out enough light to see the road by. Freyja had a boar of her own and a pair of grey cats that drew her wagon. The cats had been given to her, and no telling ever said by whom. And Thor had 2 goats, and they were the strangest kindness in the whole of it. They were Tangrisnir and Tangjosta, the tooth-bearer and the tooth-grinder, and they pulled his cart. When he stopped for the night at a farmhouse where the people had nothing, he would kill both goats. He skinned them and put them in the pot, and everyone would eat well. Then he would lay the skins out on the floor and put every bone back onto them and go to sleep. In the morning the goats would be standing in the yard hole eating the thatch. But it worked every time, and it kept on working until a boy split a bone. He was called Thialfi, and he was hungry, and there was marrow in the thigh bone. He opened it with a knife and ate what was in it and put the pieces back with the rest. In the morning one of the goats came up lame in the hind leg and stayed lame. Thor took the boy and his sister as servants for it, and they went with him ever afterwards, and the goat never came right. That was the whole of the punishment of every debt anybody paid in that mythology. It was the smallest and the only one that ended with 2 children being fed. The ravens went out at dawn and came back before supper. They were Hugin and Munin, thought, and memory, and they sat on Odin's shoulders in the hall. They left every morning and went over the whole world. They came back and told him what they had seen. He said once, quietly, that he feared Hugin would not come home. Then he said that he feared more for Munin. That was the only time in all of it that the one-eyed god admitted being afraid of anything, and it was about a bird. But the light went off the roof of that hall in the end, the way it went off everything. The road was still there under the mountain, and the gate at the bottom of it was still shut. And a very long way from any of it, out where the water went past the last rock anybody had named, there was something moving. It had never been given a shape by anyone who came home. Part 17. Hafgufa. There was a book made in Norway for a king's son, and most of it was about how to behave. It taught him how to speak to men above him and men below him. It taught him how to conduct himself at court, how to buy and sell honestly, and how to hold his tongue. And then in the middle of it, because a king's son would go to sea, it stopped and told him what was out there. It was written as a father answering a boy's questions, and it never raised its voice. It treated every creature in it the way it had treated the price of flour. The father said there were 2 great beasts in that sea, and he was careful to say that there were only 2. That was the part he put weight on. He said he believed there had never been more than 2 of them in the world. He said each of them bore only 1 calf in its life, and that the calf was the same. If there had been more, he said the world would have been eaten. It was said calmly, as a piece of natural history, in the same tone as the rest of the book. It was one of the coldest sentences anybody in the north ever wrote down. The first of them was Lyngbakka, and the name meant heatherback. Men found him in fair weather when they had been out a long time, and were glad of anything. There was an island where the charts had none. It lay low in the water with a long back to it, and growth on the surface that looked from a distance like heather. Boats came alongside, men got out onto it and walked about on it, and it was firm and it took their weight, and it did not move. Somebody would go back for the pot. They would build a fire on the top of it out of what they had. A hot meal at sea was worth a great deal, and there was nowhere else to build one. But it was the fire that did it. It was always the fire. The island would begin to go down evenly without tipping and without hurrying at all. It went down the way a thing went down when it had decided to, and not when it had been startled. There was a period in which the men on it could still stand. They were still standing in an inch of water that had not been there a minute earlier. There was no wave when it went. There was a great deal of noise from the boats, and then there was none. Then the sea was flat again in the place where the island had been. But the second one was Hafgufa, and the name meant sea mist. That one was larger, and the description of it was the strangest thing in the whole book. It was not a description of an animal at all. It was a description of coastline. The father told the boy that men had often seen the Hafgufa without ever once seeing the creature. What they saw was 2 rocks standing up out of the open ocean a long way apart, with water between them. The 2 rocks were the head and the tail. They stood far enough apart that a ship could sail for a day between them and think itself in a strait. Men marked them, men steered by them and gave them names and used them the way sailors used anything that stayed still. And then at some hour that suited it, the 2 rocks would go under together. The strait would close, and whatever had been in the strait went with it. The feeding was the part the book set out in the most detail, and it did it plainly. The father said the creature would open its mouth and hold it open. Then it would belch up a great quantity of what it had been eating. He said the smell of it went out through the water for an enormous distance. Every fish within reach of that smell would turn and come towards it. He said they came in shoals and in numbers past counting. They swam in through the open mouth and went on swimming because there was room in there and no reason to stop. And when the mouth was full of them, it shut. But here the father said something nobody would expect, and it changed the whole animal. He said it ate twice in a day and no more. He said it lay still the rest of the time. That was the entire reason the men of that coast did not fear it the way they feared weather. A thing that kept a schedule could be lived beside. Storms came without notice and took whole fleets, and nobody could tell when. The Hafgufa ate in the morning and it ate in the evening. Between those hours it did nothing at all. A man who knew the hours could go out and come back and never think about it once. They were more frightened of ice and of fog and of a wind that got up in the wrong quarter. That was the North's real attitude to the thing at the edge of the map, and it did not survive into any later retelling. The Hafgufa was not a horror to them. It was the largest item on a list in a book between the price of goods and the correct way to address a bishop. It was a hazard of the trade. Every man who worked that water knew what it was and knew roughly what it did and got on with the season. And the description had come a very long way before it ever reached that book. The same creature had been written about in warmer languages, further south and a great deal further back. There were older accounts of a thing in the sea the size of an island. It had a mouth that opened and fish that swam into it of their own accord. The story had come north along the trade routes with everything else. It had been fitted to a colder sea and given a new name. By the time the father was explaining it to the boy, it had been in the world for 1,000 years already. But the old description had one detail in it that nobody had thought hard about. It was not chasing and not swimming with the jaws open the way a great fish did. The Hafgufa was described as staying still in one place with the mouth up and open, waiting for the fish to come in. And in the last few years, men went out with cameras and found something doing exactly that. They found whales in the northern water hanging themselves upright, almost still, with the head at the surface and the jaws held wide apart. The animals chased nothing. They waited. The fish came in shoals of their own accord, and when enough of them were inside, the mouth closed. It had only been watched properly and filmed properly a very short time ago. It surprised the people who had spent their lives on those animals, because nothing in their own records had described it before. The old book had described it in the 13th century in Norwegian for a boy who was going to be king, which meant the account was not an invention and had never been one. Somebody on that coast had seen a whale feeding that way. It had been in the days when men rowed out in open boats and had nothing to do for hours but look at the water. He had come home and said what he saw. It had been passed along and written down. It was set into a book of practical instruction beside the tides and the ice, exactly where the man who wrote it had thought it belonged. The monster at the edge of the world was a report. That was the thing about the North worth carrying away from it. They were not, on the whole, a people who invented sea monsters to frighten each other in the evenings. They went out on the water and they came back and they said what had been there. And if what had been there was a mouth the size of a headland standing open in the middle of the ocean, they said that too. They said it in the same voice they used for everything else. And out past the last-named rock, the water lay flat, the way it did after anything. There was nothing on the surface to say which of the two it had been. The birds came back down after a while and settled where they had settled before. The light went along the swell and off it again, and a long way under all of that, in the cold and the dark and the enormous quiet, something that had eaten in the morning was lying still. It had a long stretch of the day left to go before it would eat again. Part 18. Surtr. Every creature in this story had somebody who made it or somebody who put it where it was. The gods bred the wolf's mother and then bound the wolf. They threw the serpent into the sea with their own hands. They set the sky wolves running and chained the hound at the gate. They built the hall of snake spines that the dragon under the root came out to feed at. The old woman in the Ironwood raised her litters on purpose. A man made a dragon out of himself on a hill. A bad-tempered farmer made a draugar out of himself in a chair. Even the tree was eaten by creatures the tree had grown. But there was one that nobody made and nobody set anywhere, and nobody had ever been able to explain. Before there was ice in the north, there was fire in the south, and it had no beginning that anybody could give. Muspelheim was the name of it. It was not a country in the way the other countries were countries. It was heat and light, and it was the oldest thing in the whole account. It was older than the gods, and older than the giants, and older than the ground. When the meltwater first ran, and Ymir came together out of it, the ice was running because the heat from Muspelheim had reached it. The first event in the history of everything had happened, because that place was already burning. And at the edge of it, facing outward, there was a figure standing with a sword. His name was Surtr, which meant the Black One. The black was the black of a thing that had been in a fire and was still in it. The sword he held was described as brighter than the sun. That was the only comparison the poems ever made about him, and they made it more than once. They had a great many things to compare a sword to, and they chose that one. He had been standing there since before there was an edge for him to stand at. Nobody put him there, no god assigned him. He had no mother in any telling and no father in any telling. He had no story of his own at all, not one in the whole of that mythology. Everything else in it had a family and a grievance and a day on which something happened to it. Had a place and a sword and a direction he was facing, and that was the entire account of him from the first line to the last. But he was in no hurry, and he had never once been in a hurry. He would come north at the end and burn the whole of it, and everybody knew that. It was written down in the oldest poem the North produced. And he did not advance by so much as a step for the entire life of the world. He stood at his border with a sword in his hand while the gods built the halls that would burn, and married and quarrelled and hanged themselves on trees for knowledge. He was still standing there when they bound the wolf. He was still standing there through every winter that anyone would ever live through. The last winter came, and it came the way winters came, quietly and from the north. It was called the Fimble Winter, the Great Winter, and it was 3 winters running with no summer set between them. Snow came from all quarters. The frost went a long way into the ground and stayed there, and the ground would not come back. What was sown did not come up. What was in the byres was eaten by the second spring that was not a spring, and what went first was not the crops. And the poem was clear about that, and it took the trouble to say so before anything else. Brothers killed brothers for what was in the store. Sons of sisters broke the bond with their own kin. It became an age of axes and an age of swords, with shields split from rim to rim. It became an age of wind and an age of wolves before the world went down. Nobody kept faith with anybody. Every hall in every country had somebody sitting in it, calculating what he could take from the people he had eaten with all his life. Most of them did it, and the poem set that down as the beginning of the end of the world rather than as a consequence of it. But then 3 birds crowed in 3 places at the same hour. Jalar, the red cock, crowed in the Ironwood where the old woman kept her fire. Gullinkambi, the golden-combed, crowed in Valhalla and woke the dead men who had been waiting for exactly this. And a third one, soot red, crowed low down in the halls of hell where the sound went along the road that nobody living was on. And then the dog at the bottom of the world began to bark. Now Glam howls loud before Gnipahellir. The fetters will burst, and the wolf run free. That was the second time those words were spoken in this story, and it was the last time they were needed. The chain in the cave went. The hound came out of Gnipahellir with his breast wet. He came up the long road, northward and upward, at the run for the first time in the history of anything on the island in the lake. The ribbon came apart. Gleipnir had held for a very long time. It did not stretch and it did not fray. Then it simply was not holding any more, because the day had arrived that it had been made for. The boulder came up out of the ground, the sword fell out of his mouth. Fenrir got up off his side on the heather and shook himself. He was very much larger than he had been on the morning they rowed him out. His lower jaw went along the ground, and his upper jaw went against the sky. And if there had been more room, he would have gaped wider. He came off the island, and he did not stop. Fire went from his eyes and his nostrils. He came the whole way across the world with his mouth at its full reach. Everything between the ground and the sky went into it. There was nothing anywhere that would be put in front of him. But Jormungandr let go of his tail and came inland, and the water came with him. He had been holding the ring shut since before there were ships. When he opened his mouth, the sea had nowhere to be. It came up over the low ground and went on going, and the coast stopped existing in the order they had been settled in. He came up out of the surf, blowing venom over the air and the water. The sky above him went the colour it had gone that day in the boat, and Thor was waiting for him, and a long way above all of it. 2 wolves closed the last of the distance. Sköll took the sun, Hati took the moon. It had been the same distance every day since the first morning, and then it was not. The woman in the burning chariot was caught at last after a life of driving. The light went out of the sky in the middle of the day. The stars came loose from the roof of the world and went down. The 2 of them that had been a giant's eyes went down with the rest. Then a ship came off the flood, and it was made of the nails of dead men. It was called Naglfar, and it had been building itself for the entire history of the world. Every man who went into the ground without having his nails cut had added a little to it. The North was quite serious about this. People would cut the nails of their dead for that reason and no other. It came free on the high water with a giant at the steering oar. It had been finished for some time. Heimdall put the horn to his mouth and blew it, and the sound went into all 9 of the worlds, and the tree began to shake. The ash had been eaten from the crown and the middle and the root for the whole of its life. It stood in the middle of everything and shook, and every branch of it moved. The gods came out armed and went down to the plain. Odin rode ahead to Mimir's well and spoke to the head in the water and got his answer, and the poem never said what it was. The sky opened along a seam, and the sons of Muspel came through it. They came in a body, riding in ranks. Surtr came at the head of them, with the sword going before him brighter than the sun had been, while there was still a sun. They rode over the rainbow bridge, and it broke under them as they crossed. Everyone had always known that it had held for as long as it would ever hold. And they all came together on the plain called Vigrid, which was 100 leagues on every side. The gods went in against the creatures they had made. Odin went at the wolf and was swallowed. Vidar came in and set 1 foot on the lower jaw and took hold of the upper and tore the animal apart. He did it with a shoe made from every scrap of leather anybody in the world had ever thrown away. Thor killed the serpent. He walked 9 paces from it and went down in the venom, and he had known for a very long time that this was how it would go. And the hound killed each other, and the hand had been paid a long time before. Heimdall and Loki killed each other, and Freyr went against Surtr with no sword at all. He had given his away for a woman years earlier. He had been told what that would cost, and he had gone ahead and done it anyway. Then Surtr flung fire over the whole of the earth, and it did not take him long. It went out across the plain and over the water and into every country. It took the halls and the fields and the ships and the mounds and the roads. It took the Ironwood, which burned very well. It went down as far as fire went, and it went up as far as fire went. And under the third root, at the roaring kettle, in the mist, the one creature nobody had made or set or asked for anything went on chewing. He did not look up, and he was not touched. The sun went black, the land went under the sea, the stars came out of the sky, and the fire went up and touched the roof of the world. Then it was quiet for a while, and after that the water began to go down, and something came up out of it. It was the earth. It came up green a second time out of the same sea. There were falls of water coming off it, and an eagle flying over them looking for fish. Nobody sowed anything that first year, and the fields bore anyway. Out of everything it could have said about a new world, that was the detail the poem chose. It gave it in one line, the unsown fields would bear, but some of them came back, and they were not the ones anybody would have picked. Vidar came, who had said almost nothing in the whole of the story. Vali came, Modi and Magni came, the sons of Thor, and they were carrying the hammer between them because it had not burned. And up out of the ground, out of the country at the bottom of the road, came Balder. He had been down there since the mistletoe. Hod came up with him who had thrown it, and the two of them came together, and there was nothing left to quarrel about. They came to a green place and sat down in the grass, and they found the gaming pieces lying there. They were the gold pieces the old gods had played with in the mornings in the first age, before any of it. They had been lying in that grass through everything. The new ones picked them up and turned them over and looked at them. They knew what they were, and they could not have said who had used them. They sat and talked for a while about the things that had happened, and about the wolf, and about the old prophecies. And two people came out of a wood, and they had slept through the whole of it. Their names were Leif and Lifthrasir. They had been hidden in a wood called Hodmimir's Holt, and they had lived on the morning dew. They came out into the light of a new sun. The sun was not the one that had been eaten before the wolves caught her. The woman driving the old one had borne a daughter. The daughter had taken the reins, and she would run the same road her mother had run. Nobody was behind her, that was the difference, and the poem made nothing of it. So there was a green earth and unsown fields, and two people walking out of a wood. There was a new sun going across the sky with nothing following it. That was where it should have ended, and every instinct anybody ever had about how a story finishes would put the ending there. But there was one more verse. It was the last thing in the poem, and it was not about any of them. There comes the dark dragon flying, the shining serpent, up from the dark hills below. He carries corpses in his wings as he flies over the field. That was the end of the prophecy. The very last image the North left of its own world was Níðhöggr, after the fire and the flood, after the green earth and the children in the grass. It was a dragon coming over the new fields with the dead in his feathers still flying. He had not been made by anybody. He had not been set there by anybody. Nobody had asked him to come, and nobody had ever once been able to say where he came from. The fire had gone over the top of the whole world and had not reached him under the root. And the poem stopped there, with him still in the air, over a field that had only just started again.